looking forward to this.
Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Please allow me to introduce you to our guest today, who is actually a dean, now the incoming dean of the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Mario, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me on your show. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, your book was just awesome. Before we get started, I'd like to have you tell the folks a little bit about your background. You were just, you're an outgoing professor at the Wharton School, but if you could tell them a little bit about your background and your expertise, that would be great.
Well, absolutely. So first of all, I have an accent. I've been living here in the United States for the last 33 years. But I'm from Spain originally. I'm now a US citizen, and I've been an academic all my life. Very boring, but at the same time, very exciting, in the sense that I think I have been privileged to be able to spend most of my time thinking about what is changing in the world. And I was trained as an economist and as a sociologist. And as you know, my approach to studying what's going on in the world is actually to look at it from different angles, from different perspectives. And again, I mean, I'm fascinated by all of these big transformations that we're going through, and I'm trying to make sense out of them. And then I write books, or I write articles trying to, communicate with various kinds of audiences, all of those things that I learn.
So why did you write this book? And by the way, anybody who gets your book is not going to be able to put this book down. What, you have a copy of the book you wanted to show everybody?
I do, but it's under my camera. Let me just move the camera really quickly. Here it is, okay?
Excellent, excellent. So tell us about why you wrote this book.
So I was about 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I was making lots of presentations to my students, to other audiences as I traveled the world. And I was detecting that people were very uneasy about the amount of change in the world. So people were fearsome. And I thought, let me write a book that could be like a roadmap, how to think about all of these transformations in the world. And as you know, I'm an optimist by nature. And so I wanted to write a book that would be an optimistic take on all that is going on, under one assumption, which is that people would be willing to recognize that things are changing and would be willing to do something about it, as opposed to, try to say, well, I'm not interested, or I'm going to ignore all of those changes. So I wrote the book with those kinds of people in mind, because I felt that, once again, that many of them felt a little bit lost in all of these transformations. That was essentially the motivation that drove me to write the book.
How many hours of research and how many papers, books, and other research did you conduct and read to write this book? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, a lot of effort went into it. So I spent about 5 years researching and writing the book. And I wouldn't be able to tell you a number of hours, but I can tell you that it became my primary activity. I worked, I'm not going to say night and day, but every day of the week. And I also was very lucky to be able to hire some people who also helped me collect some of the data and analyze some of the data. So it was a team of people in the end who helped me put all of this together. But yeah, I mean, writing a book, it's something that takes at least I would say 3 or 4 years, and in this case it took me about 5.
Wow, yeah, and I love these kinds of books with lots of research done. That's why I like Malcolm Gladwell and Adam Grant, who's a colleague of yours at Wharton.
Yeah,
that's what I love about these kinds of books. And we just had Josh Linkner on, and he writes similar types of books. How has the pandemic, and you talk about this in the book, how has the pandemic impacted the future trends in business? Or was this just a moment in time that's a blip that really won't make a bigger difference than what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, so the pandemic struck about 7 months before the book came out. So I had the opportunity to adjust some of my analysis But you see, this pandemic has triggered, as you know, a social crisis and an economic crisis that has been, at least so far, very different from other crises that we've had in the past. It is a pandemic that essentially has accelerated pre-existing trends. So, for example, population aging is now proceeding faster. The rise of the emerging markets of Asia is now happening faster. The adoption of technology, I think that is the best possible example. So in other words, the future that I describe in the book now is arriving a little bit earlier than we thought before the pandemic. So look, my only regret, Mark, is that instead of titling the book 2030, perhaps I should have used 2028 as the title. That's my only regret.
And why 2028? Because it's happening so much faster?
Because it's happening faster. And actually, if you recrunch the numbers, so I recalculated the numbers in light of what has happened over the last 18 months, actually, many of the things that I describe in the book now, instead of happening around the year 2030, they happen about a couple of years earlier.
Interesting. Yeah,
but the same things are happening. That's the key point that I want to emphasize, right? So it's not that the future is changing, it's that the future is arriving faster. That's the change.
And that's really scary for everybody. I mean, I think that
I think
speed of it is.
Rather than scary, what I would say is that it makes it even more urgent for us to adapt.
For sure. So you paint a picture similar to the Jetsons. If you saw the cartoon, the Jetsons, that's what I grew up on, of the world where robots do most of the work at a manufacturing plant. We're seeing that happen rapidly now. What will that mean for good paying union jobs that don't require a college degree? And where will the non-college technical jobs come from?
Yes, look, this is the big issue of our time. And it has been a big problem for the last 20 years, but we haven't been paying enough attention to it, which is in this whole process of globalization and technological change, there are distinct groups of people who are being left behind. They're losing their jobs. Maybe they're in their 50s. It's very difficult for them to look for another kind of job. And so I think it has become imperative, if we really want to survive as a country, as a society, as an economy, to pay attention to that problem. Because otherwise you get what we're getting, which is that people then decide to vote for the extremes, right? People become radicalized. And what we have is more tensions in society. So I think we have misunderstood over the last 20 years how important it is to ensure that nobody is left behind, right? And we need to start taking action on that, because otherwise I think it's going to continue undermining the pillars of our democracy and of our economy. I mean, that's something really serious is at stake here.
Oh, no question about it. In the beginning, you mentioned how everyone assumes that China will be leading the country, will be the leading country in the world. And India, which is known for its IT dominance, isn't thought of as one of the global leaders. But I gather you see India differently. How do you view their place in the world?
Yeah, I'm actually very bullish about India. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you catch me and you ask me that question after having a glass of wine, I would probably tell you that I'm more bullish about India than China, right? Mm-hmm. And why do I say that? Well, I say that because I think India has certain advantages that China lacks. One is that India, other than Pakistan, is perceived as a good country in the world. China, by contrast, has a territorial dispute with each of its 17 neighbors. I mean, that is pretty unusual, okay? Not only that, as you know, there are many political difficulties in China. And in India, look, in spite of all of the bottlenecks that they have, poor infrastructure, lack of enough electricity and so on and so forth, still you see all of these companies and all of these entrepreneurs doing really well. So I think the Indians have such an entrepreneurial spirit, right? I know you like that very much, right, Mark?
Yeah.
And I think that also exists in China, but I think India is just so much better at that. And also, and this is, at least in my own thinking, really important, they have a younger population. And I think that's going to be a pretty important factor in the near future. Now, having said that, let's not forget, I mean, the US will continue to be an influential country in the world. It won't be able to impose its own will. on other countries unilaterally as in the past. But come on, I mean, I think as we speak, the American economy is demonstrating yet again that it's extremely dynamic, that it's very flexible, it's growing really quickly, right, after this phenomenal crisis. So I wouldn't discount the US. All I'm saying is, look, we're not alone. The global economy has changed. There are other economies that are going to be really important. And it's not just China. I think India is also going to be a big player.
Well, India is going to give a counterbalance to China. I mean, I think India's success is very important to the rest of the world, right?
I think you're right. If you think about this geopolitically, I think it is a good thing that there's another country with about the same number of people, India, 1.3 billion in each case. And it's a country that is different. It is a democracy. I think that's a big plus. And it has been a democracy since independence in the late 1940s. And I'm not saying that we should play global chess here and try to see how we can use India to counterbalance China. But all I'm saying is that we are in a multipolar world. And the fact that it's not just the US and China, like it used to be the US and the Soviet Union, I think that's good news. The fact that there's also India, there's also Europe there, although they have a lot of problems. I think that's positive. I think it's good that we are in a multipolar world.
No question. Have countries like Sweden, who've opened their doors to refugees from Syria, mostly doing it to make up for the low birth rate, as Germany has been doing, as opposed to humanitarian reasons? And do you think that will turn out to be a smart move, especially because of the cultural differences?
Yeah, look, so refugees is part of a broader topic of immigration, right? And you're asking somebody who is an immigrant, right? So I'm an immigrant in the US. Now I am a US citizen as well. And look, I got very lucky. I was very lucky to be able to migrate to this country because the US is a country of opportunity in the world. There's no question about it and continues to be. But immigration is a politically sensitive issue. And so it has to be channeled. It has to be managed. And that's what I think we're failing to do. I think we should try to learn from Canada and from Australia. For me, those are the two countries in the world that are managing immigration really, really well. They are, as you said, able to bring in younger people and in so doing rebalancing the age structure of their population. I think Sweden and Germany have not been as successful, although both of them are also very important destinations for immigrants. But they have also been more successful than we have. So I think we have a lot of learning to do here. And we certainly need to think that immigration is an opportunity. But it's an opportunity only if we have some kind of consensus in the United States about how we can benefit from it. But right now, as you know, we're very far from that. What we have is a major conflict over how much immigration is appropriate.
You said that Australia and Canada do it well. What do they do that we could learn from?
Well, as you know, these are both very big countries, a lot of space, a lot of natural resources. And they realized a number of years ago that what they needed to do was to have a system whereby you can welcome immigrants that are going to have jobs in the economy. And you need both immigrants with low skills and with high skills, right, in this economy that we're in. And for example, let me just give you an example. In Canada, if a student from abroad gets a degree from a Canadian university, automatically they give that person a 2-year visa so that he or she can demonstrate in an actual job that it would be worth having that person in Canada. Here in the United States, no such program exists. So we spend a lot of our own money training students from other countries, and then we send them away. So I don't think that's a good way of investing our money, right? Because as you know, a university education is expensive. So those are the reasons why I think Canada and Australia, at least in my view, are, in many respects, the models to imitate.
Well, going back to China, we see China has increased from encouraging their populace to go from 1 child to 2, and now it's 3. Was this necessary for them?
Well, let me provide you with an answer that maybe you weren't expecting. I don't think it's going to matter what the government says, quite frankly. Because even if the government in China says that now people can have, or women can have 3 babies, on average in China, women are not going to have 3 babies. I can assure you of that. Because now most women in China have an education and they want to have a career. You see, in the United States, we also had a one-child policy. It was called a college education for women. And, when you take a look at the numbers here in the United States, college-educated women in the United States, on average, have 1 kid. That's our one-child policy. So in China, unless they prevent women from getting an education, the number is not going to go up to 3, no matter what the government says. But of course, they are scared because their population is aging so quickly that before you know it, they're going to have more people in retirement than people working. Think about that, right?
Right.
By the way, Japan is going to be the first country in the world that gets into that situation at around the year 2035 or 2040. They're going to have the same number of people working as people in retirement. And as you know, that is not sustainable.
And, it made me think when I was reading your book that China could not afford a war because wars are usually fought by people under the age of 25. They can't afford to lose large numbers of their male population in a war, or just people in general, because it's not the older people who are typically fighting these wars. So I thought that was kind of something I pulled from your book. According to your book, that products, just because of the sheer size of the Asian market, there'll be more products developed specifically for them, and that will end up affecting what American consumers buy, similar to how Western products have impacted Asia. How's that going to work?
Well, look, as you know, I teach at a business school, and I've studied this thoroughly. For the last 100 years, most of the brands that we purchase, most of the companies, have essentially been paying attention first to the European consumer, and then more recently to the American consumer. That was the gold standard. Most brands in the world would launch new products and services that cater to the needs of those consumers. Why? Because those were the biggest markets. It's as simple as that. But now that is shifting. By the year 2030, the biggest markets in the world, consumer markets that is, will be in Asia. And so brands increasingly, including American brands, if they want to be successful, they will need to incorporate more of the tastes and the preferences of those consumers over there. And by the way, Mark, it doesn't end there. The other very important consequence is regulation. Right now, Europe and the United States provide most of the regulations, product regulations in the world. That's also going to change because as China and then India become the biggest consumer markets, their governments will increasingly regulate consumer products. So regulation at a global level is also going to change as a result of this.
Do you see China as the real superpower because of their size and economic clout? I mean, I kind of feel like the United States is on the wane and China's on the rise.
Well, not really.
Maybe it's now their turn.
Not really. I'm still a true believer in the capacity of the United States as a country and as an economy to be the leader in the world. We may have a smaller population, but the American worker is still the most productive in the world. The American worker is still the best educated in the world. We have the best, as you know, research and development system in this country. I mean, we produced in record time 3 vaccines, right? Effective vaccines against COVID-19. Not only that, we also have, and you know this far better than I do, the best entrepreneurial ecosystem in the world. There's no question about that. So I see that China has many strengths. There's no question about it. And one of them, of course, is size. And the other is that they're patient. I think perhaps if I had to choose the one thing that I think represents a huge advantage for China is that they seem to be very patient. They've been, very methodically working at developing their country for the last 40 or 50 years. And they've been remarkably successful. And so I think, other countries in the world should take notice. But I don't think the US is out of the game, not at all, at least not in my lifetime. That would be my take on it.
I hope that's the case because I feel like the United States is like great empires don't get beaten from the outside. They typically get beaten from the inside. And
that's another matter.
yeah, and the huge
And
division that we're seeing. Our
absolutely,
competitive differentiator is the melting pot that we are, and the
absolutely,
fact that we're entrepreneurial.
absolutely. And I think you're putting your finger on something really important, which is something that, once again, I think as Americans right now at this juncture, we need to realize, which is that all of these frictions, all of these divisions, the polarization of our politics, this is not good. This is not good. And as you said, um, many empires, many great countries declined because of internal divisions.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that that's going to change for us over these next 4 years. I get the impression from your book that cryptocurrency and forms of currency that have yet to be developed might become more of an online version of the Dutch tulips. What's your view of that?
Well, look, Mark, I have to tell you a little anecdote here. I include the topic of cryptocurrencies in pretty much every class that I teach at Wharton. And, my students are 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds. They're considerably younger than I am. And when I tell them about all of the reservations that I have concerning cryptocurrencies, you know what they tell me? They tell me that I'm too old to understand. So they tell me, you belong to a different generation. You don't really grasp the potential of cryptocurrency. And I must say, it's a revolutionary technology. There's no question about it. But my main issue with it is that I don't see governments or central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, giving up their monopoly over money so easily. And by the way, I don't think it will be good for the economy. I mean, we want the government to have, or the central bank to have, monetary policy as a tool for fighting crisis. And if we have cryptocurrencies, especially decentralized ones driven by an algorithm, we may lose that very important instrument that we have to deal with crises, such as the one that we just went through, the recession last year, which, if you remember, it was the Federal Reserve that saved the day. And I would argue that the same happened 12 years ago at the time of the global financial crisis. So I have serious reservations about cryptocurrencies. But having said that, I think it's inevitable that some kind of cryptocurrency will become widely used around the world. Let's not forget, it could be that a government issues it. As you know, the Chinese are going to launch in the next few months a digital renminbi, and the Federal Reserve is drawing plans to launch a digital dollar. So we'll see what happens. I think we shouldn't get too excited about it. I think we're still in the initial stages. We're trying to figure out what is the best way. But is it a revolutionary technology? Absolutely. Are we going to be using digital money in the future? Of course. The big question is it going to be Bitcoin or is it going to be a digital dollar? I think that's the big question.
Yeah, I think that governments need to be able to follow the money, because otherwise it almost becomes like Italy was for a while, where it's an underground economy and they can't tax it and they can't follow it. And it makes it easier for people who might do harm to society to be able to move money around quickly. So
Absolutely.
I think that's what the Chinese were certainly worried about. Why is compartmentalizing and linear thinking bad for us as a society? You talk about this in the book.
Well, it's bad because you're focusing on just one thing, one trend, let's say population. And then if you only focus on population and you don't understand technology, for example, then you're likely to end up saying, oh, we have way too many people in the world. We're running out of resources. But hey, if at the same time you consider the possibility for technological change to help us expand the universe of possibilities, then maybe overpopulation is not such a big problem. So that's why in the book I promote what I call lateral thinking, which is essentially connecting the dots, putting together different kinds of trends, and then seeing, if you look for the interactions among them, what are the consequences, what are the implications. And if you do that, then you're in a far better position to identify opportunities and also to anticipate threats.
Yeah, I think a lot of examples you give in the book go along that way. You write a lot about Africa, and you're right. I don't think we have a true appreciation for the size of Africa when you showed that in your book and its potential. I couldn't believe how big Africa was after you overlaid China and the United States and Russia onto the map. Will Africa eventually escape its third world label? And what is Kasvasa, and how will that impact Africa?
Okay, so Africa is, I think, the next frontier in the global economy. Africa is coming of age. It is coming of age because the population is growing. But as you said, they have plenty of room because Africa geographically is bigger than China, India, the United States, Europe, and Japan combined, right? But there's also something else going on in Africa. The middle class is growing. It's only 20% of the population, but it's growing. And they're using technology. For example, they're far more advanced when it comes to mobile payments or when it comes to telemedicine than we are. Out of necessity, of course, because they never had a banking infrastructure. They never had ATMs. And then I want to address the other issue that you mentioned at the end, cassava as a plant, right? You see, the challenge in Africa will be in the next few years to feed and to educate a growing population. If they can meet that challenge, not only those people won't be poor, but also the economy is going to grow, right? Because agriculture and education are very important engines for economic growth. And so cassava is a type of crop that originates from South America that is very resilient to droughts and has certain other characteristics that make it ideal as the main staple in the diet of people in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's easy to grow, and you can do all sorts of things with it. You can turn it into flour and so on. So I believe that we're going to see very soon an agricultural revolution in Africa. That's going to create jobs. That's going to be feeding the growing population. And I think slowly but surely, we're going to see that as a result of that, the middle class in Africa will grow, not just in the cities, but also in the countryside. And so Africa, I think, is going to become a very dynamic part of the global economy. I'm very, very bullish on Africa as well.
And a lot of private equity are also getting very bullish on it. Lots of our Wharton students who are investing in that part of the world.
Absolutely.
We have a question from India. Do you see religion becoming less and less important in day-to-day life, and your views on clash of civilizations?
Yes. So secularization, if you remember, is something that started in the 1960s in Europe and the United States. And it was partially reversed in some parts of the developing world. I mean, let's not forget, there was a religiously inspired revolution in Iran, for example, right? and that had major consequences globally. So I think there is this back and forth. There is this ups and downs in terms of the importance of organized religion in the world. I think it's a reality. I think it is something that we need to analyze and study really well. But regarding India, what I see in India is, number one, more and more women are getting an education, right? That is essential. Number two, a very dynamic entrepreneurial sector, really important in India. Yes, there are castes. Yes, there are divisions. Yes, there are problems here and there. But I see India as a country that is making progress in terms of delivering better standards of living for its population. So I don't see a problem necessarily with India. Now, the last part of the question was about the clash of civilizations. And I would have to agree that we continue to have that in the world. And it's not just Islam or extreme versions of Islam versus other conceptions of life. I think right now, the biggest contest at the ideological level that we're seeing is between liberal democracy and strong men in the world. So Europe and the United States versus Russia, versus Turkey, versus Venezuela, versus China in many ways as well. So I think we're going back to, I guess, where we were in the 1920s, that there was this increasing contest or competition between, on the one hand, the values of liberal democracy, and on the other, the concept of the strongman or dictatorship, authoritarianism. And I think it's a very serious contest that is going on right now. And I very much hope that liberal democracy wins yet again.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because, China's leader has basically made himself a dictator, right? Because there's no more 10-year term to him. And Vladimir Putin has been essentially the dictator for Russia all this time. But China seems to be doing well under this kind of combination of democracy and dictatorship. Is that the way you see a lot of countries going? I think the last president was hoping to do something similar.
Well, look, if you take a look at the last 70 years since the end of World War II, for every dictatorship that has delivered a higher standard of living to the population, there is, roughly speaking, about 5 or 6 that did just the opposite. So the track record when it comes to economic performance and standards of living is so much better for the democracies in the world. Much, much better. I mean, there's no question about that if you think about historically. The problem, of course, now is that China is such a big country, right? Yeah. And it is an influential country to the point that it's going to become the largest economy and the largest consumer market very soon, possibly now before the year 2030. So just one case seems to be very influential in terms of how people are thinking about all of this because of its size and because of the repercussions that the rise of China, is going to have on a global scale. But even in China, right? And again, I'd like to go back to my comparison with India. I feel much more optimistic about India in the long run than China, because I think that, for example, the basic political issue is so much more difficult to handle in China than in India, which once again has a working democracy since 1947.
I tell you, what scares me is cybersecurity.
Oh, sure.
All the billions, apparently we outspend, let's say, the next 10 countries combined, but it really doesn't mean anything if 4 guys in a room can go shut it all down.
Yeah.
And so where do you see this all going? And do you think that the US and other countries will still spend big money on large military tanks and everything else when it seems that they can be shut off from a distance?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think cyber attacks have become the new poor people's weapon, right? And of course, we're very vulnerable because we have become so reliant on information systems. And if we continue moving in the direction of implementing the blockchain and artificial intelligence, we're going to become even more reliant on them. Look, I think there are several ways in which you can tackle this problem. One, of course, is by investing in countermeasures, and we should certainly do that. But another one is to come to agreements with those states in the world, North Korea, Russia, China, that are weaponizing cyber attacks, right? The same way that we came to agreements about nuclear weapons, I think we should come to agreements about cyber attacks. And I think it has to be a mix of countermeasures and diplomacy that help us be safe from this point of view.
Yeah, I think the same thing, and I think that's smart. Like you said, the same thing they did with nuclear weapons, they're going to have to come up with an agreement on that, because I'm sure we can turn off their lights as well, and you just have total chaos in the world.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, we could.
One of the questions that we have from in the audience: do you think our planet can bear a growing population in Africa? And you talk about, we're really using a very small part of the world in terms of growing crops. It seems like.
So we haven't talked about the environment and about climate change and about resources. And I think this question actually triggers all of those topics on my mind. And look, the problem in the world is, from the point of view of resources and climate change, I don't think it's the number of people, because the way we're going with fewer and fewer babies, even in Africa, the number of babies is dropping, although it's still about 4 per woman. So by the year 2060 or so, we're going to reach a maximum number of people on Earth, right? It's going to take a while, right, to reach that number still, but we're going to reach it. I think the more immediate problem is the rise of the middle class. So why? Well, because the middle class consumer is a very wasteful consumer, but the middle class consumer has a car, doesn't ride a bike. The middle class consumer likes to eat beef. And as you know, beef is much more environmentally unfriendly than chicken, for example, right? And so the pattern of consumption of the middle class is inimical to the environment. There's no question about it. And that's why I argue in the book that we need to change as consumers. We need to become less wasteful. Because if we don't do that, I think it's going to be very difficult to reverse climate change. And we're going to get into a situation in which we fight in the world over natural resources. Because now it's not just Europe and Japan and the United States that have a middle class. It's also China, it's also India, it's Indonesia, it's Thailand, it's Brazil, it's Turkey. We don't want to be in that situation in which we're competing for natural resources and for the right to pollute in the world.
Mario, you're not going to take away my Philly cheesesteaks, are you?
No, absolutely not. Look, I think I don't want to take beef away. I love beef, okay? Although perhaps we should eat a little bit less of it, if only for health reasons. But what I think we need to be, quite frankly, Mark, is less wasteful. Let me give you an example. The US Agriculture Department reports that about 31% of the food that makes its way to American households gets wasted. About 31%. That's because we cook too much food at home. That's because we buy big containers of everything. That's because we forget about the food that we have in the refrigerator, so it goes bad. That percentage, 31% waste, I think we should be reducing. And that will help us, feed other people in the world who don't have enough food. But more importantly, agriculture is a major source of carbon emissions. So that will help us reduce carbon emissions in the world.
And we have a question right now from somebody knows. How will carbon impact changes by 2030? The focus on reduction for some parts of the world versus the higher cost of investment and lower returns. Will this hinder change due to global imbalance of dealing with increasing cost of energy?
Well, the energy challenge, I think, quite frankly, we have the instruments at our disposal to change the paradigm. But I think we still don't have the political will or the consensus in the society to once and for all say, we're gonna, essentially eliminate our dependence on fossil fuels. As you know, there are some automobile companies, both in Europe and the United States, that have committed to electric-only vehicles within 20 years from now. I think that's the way to go. And I think we need governments to say, we want to become carbon-free. Look, over the last couple of years, both wind and solar have become competitive with coal when it comes to generating power, electricity. So we've gotten to the point that we have alternatives. But we need, I think, more of a political will, and we need more of a social consensus that we need to abandon fossil fuels once and for all. Now, it's going to be painful, don't get me wrong. I mean, Texas is going to suffer. West Virginia is going to suffer. But once again, what we need to do is ensure that those people who are going to be negatively affected, the people who will lose their jobs if we move away from fossil fuels, that we don't leave them behind. So we need to, at the same time, make the transition, but also ensure that nobody who loses jobs because of this is left behind.
Yeah, I think smart government will transition once they find replacements for those jobs. And I think those people have this fear, especially under President Biden, that he'll just get rid of it all. But he's not stupid. He's not going to go and put millions of people out of work without having someplace for them to go. We once thought that, this is another question from the audience, we once thought the world was trending towards more democracy, but now it doesn't seem that way. What do you think the world will look like in terms of political norms in 2030?
Yeah. So as we were discussing earlier, we're in the middle of a big battle in the world between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. And look, this goes in waves, ups and downs. The 1930s were horrible. And look what happened. We went into World War II, right? And then you're right. During the early phases of the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, there were more dictatorships in the world than democracies. And by the way, many of those dictatorships in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America were supported by Europe and by the United States as a way to contain the Soviet Union. But then we had this outburst of new democracies all over the world in the 80s, in the 90s. So we're approaching the end of that cycle, and now we have this big contest. I think all of us who care about liberal democracy and about freedom, I think we should become more active and try to help people understand that a dictatorship is not a good thing. I was born under a dictatorship in Spain, and I can tell you that not having the freedom to say what you think is something that you don't want to lose, okay? I mean, you want to have that freedom. And I don't think we should put people in the position in which they have to choose between economic growth or standards of living on the one hand and democracy on the other. We want to promote both. We want to have both economic freedoms and economic advancement. And we also want to have political freedoms. But it's incumbent upon us to help the world and people in the world understand that.
I wonder if some cultures can handle that, because from a cultural standpoint, look at what's happened to Libya, look what's happened to Iraq, and some of the other countries in the Middle East. And even Egypt had to go back to being a dictatorship. I wonder, because they're very tribal in that part of the world, and some other parts of the world as well, where it's difficult to make democracy seem to work. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the jury is still out on that one. So there are certain things that need to be in place for democracy to work. So people thought that maybe education was one of them. But look, in India, when the country became independent, like 40% of the population was illiterate. They couldn't read or write. And yet democracy succeeded in India, right? So there are also arguments out there that a country needs to be relatively rich.
Japanese knife is not a toy. This $30 traditionally made
there's somebody
the world by storm.
Somebody needs to.
Well, I'm most optimistic about, I think, the fact.
Mark?
Yeah, I hear you. I think that person caught the fact that they actually had their.
Has had many unfortunate, many negative.
I have him. Okay.
Yeah, you can. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, I couldn't hear myself actually.
Yeah.
So, so I think as I was saying, the jury is still out, because there's so many factors that are behind a successful democracy, and it's very difficult to pinpoint one of them. Like, is it education? Is it a certain income level? Is it a certain culture? Right? Because as you know, we have, well-functioning democracies in Europe, for sure, in North America, some in Latin America, but we also have them in Asia. Taiwan is a working democracy. South Korea is a working democracy. We also have them in Africa, like Namibia, Botswana. Those are countries that where democracy is working really well. So I think it's difficult to pinpoint, right? It's a combination of factors, but what I think is also important is, new democracies. When a country first becomes a democracy, the situation is not very stable. And so we need to help those countries that become democracies grow into them, right? Become more stable democracies. And that's something that takes time.
And I think we need to lead and show people that we can do it ourselves, as we have done for 200 plus years, and continue to hopefully do it. Question from the audience: if appropriate to your discussion, your view on the global monopoly of tech giants and their influence on politics, economics, values, freedoms, how should they be more aggressively regulated, or should they not be regulated?
Well, I worry about two aspects of the growth of these digital platforms and the big tech companies. So the first thing is about privacy and about data and information. And, the funny thing, Mark, is that so many people are so willing to put all of their private, most intimate information in the hands of these companies, right? And I try to be a little bit restrictive in terms of what I share with them, but some people just share everything, right? With those platforms on which they have an account. That's one issue. The other issue is how much market power do they have? Do they have monopoly power? Can they fix prices? Can they impose on smaller companies or on consumers costs that they shouldn't be imposing? And even more importantly, from an entrepreneurial point of view, if these companies become too dominant, is that going to stifle entrepreneurial activities, right? From new ventures and so on. So do they need to be regulated? Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, having said that, the question is how much regulation, what type of regulation? But to make matters a little bit more complicated, Mark, and to go back to some of the other questions that you asked, who is going to be regulating? As you know, right now, when it comes to privacy, the toughest regulator in the world is the European Union, right? And when it comes to market power and price fixing and so on and so forth, I think it's both the US and the European Union. It remains to be seen how tough as a regulator China will be. Because as you know, many of these platforms are in China. And as you know, over the last few months, there's been some crackdowns on some of the biggest platforms and tech businesses in China. So all of this is still up in the air. And I wonder how we're going to be dealing with those two basic issues, privacy on the one hand and price fixing on the other, right? And abuse of market power.
Here's another question from the audience. How do you feel about embracing nuclear energy to be more efficient, effectively transition from fossil fuels?
So I think, unfortunately, nuclear has to play a role because we just don't have at the moment right now enough technologies for generating electricity that will help us reduce the carbon footprint. That's essentially the big advantage of nuclear. Now, nuclear has many disadvantages. One of them is problems with accidents, but the other one, of course, is what you do with the byproducts. So I think at least for the next 20 or 30 years, nuclear will have to play a role. I just don't see any other path to a future where we have green and renewable energy. But how to make it from today to that future without nuclear, I think is going to be really hard. I think we do need nuclear.
In your book, you talked about the propaganda that immigrants take quality jobs away is a false narrative. What's the real truth about immigrants?
Look, I'm biased, I guess, because as I said at the beginning, I'm an immigrant myself, but immigrants make all sorts of contributions. Most immigrants are of working age. So it's a myth that they don't work or that they're using up government services. Look at how many companies in the United States have been founded by immigrants. Look, a third of the companies from the Silicon Valley that became public companies, so they're now listed in the stock market, a third were founded or co-founded by immigrants. So many of the technologies, many of the amazing companies that we have in the United States that have created millions of jobs were founded or co-founded by immigrants. So I think immigration, once again, if you manage the process, can be a force for good. It helps you rebalance the age structure. I think it helps you with the dynamism in the economy. But again, I have to admit that I'm an immigrant myself, so maybe I'm biased. But I think all the research and all of the information that we have seems to indicate that immigration on balance has been positive for the United States.
Yeah, I'm totally in agreement with you. I'm second generation here, but I think that's our competitive advantage is the melting pot, and we don't want to give that advantage away. You write about changes in cities, which take up 1% of the land, but are home to 55% of the population. What's the future of cities like Philadelphia and so forth?
Well, I think the future of cities is complicated. Because cities, not only they are major sources of pollution, as you're saying, but most of the economic inequalities that we have, for example, in the United States, play out in cities. And so I think we need to reinvent cities. Technology, I think, will help us do that. But we need to think about cities as places where, people can take advantage of the opportunities, but at the same time, we don't hurt the environment. And I think we're only in the beginning of that process. So rather than heat islands, as you know, cities are also known as heat islands, we have to turn cities into green islands. And by the way, urban agriculture has to play a role in that. Cities that are introducing more agriculture are actually in a far better position to be environmentally friendly. So I think we need a revolution. I think we need a second urban revolution in the world that turns our cities into green islands.
I worked on a business plan for a hydroponic farm, and what you can grow in 2,000 square feet is like 5 or 10 acres of stuff. And turns out that Philadelphia only has like 2 days of food if we were shut down and couldn't access food. So having hydroponic farms in cities would probably fit what you're talking about. How important is it to identify a planet that can be inhabited by citizens of Earth before we run short of resources to support the planet? What do you think that looks like?
Sorry, could you restate the question?
Sure. How important is it to identify a planet in the solar system or maybe another galaxy that can be inhabited by us before we run out of resources here to support the planet?
Well, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think we can make a lot of improvements here on planet Earth in terms of how we use existing resources. And as I said earlier, we should try to become less wasteful in the use of resources. But at the same time, I think we should continue to engage in space exploration. Is the moon, is Mars, because not only we will learn things that will help us improve life on Earth, but as the person seems to be suggesting, we may be able to colonize those other parts of the world. And look, I think it is intrinsic to the human spirit to explore. We still have parts of the Earth that need exploration, like Antarctica, like the oceans, and so on and so forth. But I think it is very healthy for the world to allocate resources to space exploration. Once again, because we can learn from that, and also because I strongly believe, like you do, that at some point in the future, maybe we will start colonizing other heavenly bodies. I'm not going to see that in my lifetime, I'm afraid, but it is something that I think we should be investing in right now.
You read about the concept of basic universal income. What is it, and do you think that will actually happen?
Well, I like a minimum guaranteed income for families that need it, but I don't like it to be universal. So I don't think every family should be getting payments. So again, in the context of technological unemployment, automation, and so on, I think we may find ourselves in the near future in a situation in which we have to guarantee a basic income, because otherwise we will have so much social dislocation, and also we wouldn't have enough purchasing power in the economy. Let's not forget, we are in a consumer-centered economy. If let's say 20 or 30% of people are unemployed because of technology, because of automation, and they don't have any income, then how is the economy gonna work? So I think the time has probably arrived for us to have a national debate about a guaranteed minimum income.
I'm 60. I've never seen in my lifetime that minimum wage actually works. The world is still, round, and the sun comes up and everything. And yet I remember when people are getting paid $1.25 an hour, and everybody at the top, as soon as it gets raised, they keep raising the cost of everything. Maybe it should be a combination of salary and part of the profit sharing. Maybe that's the way to go for that. How will rising healthcare costs, this is a question from the audience, how will rising healthcare costs impact the US economy and society as population ages and patients want expensive treatments.
You mean within groups within society, or
Yeah,
that might need special attention, you mean?
yes.
Well, that's undeniably always going to be the case because we live in very complex societies and the economy itself is very complex. And we have different kinds of people, old, young, educated or not so educated, and so on and so forth. And so inevitably, look, we have an economy that, there's no question about it, generates inequality. So we have to take care of the people who fall behind, because otherwise, there's going to be too much social dislocation. I think that's my general way of thinking about the problem.
Practically every business believes millennials are the fastest growing market, but that isn't true. Who is and what do businesses need to know and do to take advantage of this in the market? And you write about this in your book.
How important is it? Sorry, the connection was wavering a little bit.
Sure. Practically every business believes millennials are the fastest growing market, but that isn't true. In the book, you write, who is the fastest growing market and how do you take advantage of it?
Well, the fastest growing market defined by age right now is going to be population above age 60. And that's because it's becoming so big. Look, in Japan, it already is 35% of the population that is above the age of 60. So it's no longer the younger generations. So I'm not sure whether that was the part of the question that I was supposed to answer, but I think we're seeing a dramatic realignment in terms of by age of consumer markets because of population aging. It's as simple as that. And so my prediction is that by the year 2030, the biggest segment of the market in terms of purchasing power in Japan, in China, in Europe, here in the United States, is going to be people above the age of 60.
When will we see women get parity with men in leading companies, sitting on boards, raising capital? And why are women finding it harder to find a mate?
Yeah, not soon enough.
Talk about this in the book.
Yeah, not soon enough. And a lot of progress has been made. But as I think we all know, there continues to be discrimination in different ways. And so I think we need to remain vigilant, and we need to look for ways to ensure that the talent that women have is used to the fullest, because that will benefit everyone, not just the women themselves, but also everybody else, including the men and the children. So I think it's really important for us to realize that we all benefit if we can use the talent that exists in the world without discrimination. And yes, it's been way too long that we haven't been using that talent from women in positions at companies or in the government and in other walks of life. So not soon enough. That's my short answer.
Here's my last question. And I'm sorry we couldn't cover everything in the book because I wanted to cover about your 7 principles you list in thinking about laterally. But I know you also have a busy day. So here's the last question. It comes from our audience. What do you see as the top market opportunities over the next 10 years for entrepreneurs?
Well, number one, the intersection between demographics and technology. So if you're listening now, you want to be an entrepreneur, think about, all of these different technologies that have been developed, but then connect that to the demographic trends, because you need to pursue a technology that will resonate with some group in society or with everybody in society, right? Number two, I think there's going to be huge opportunities for entrepreneurship in anything and everything that has to do with sustainability. There's no question about it, right? And then lastly, for people beyond the age of 70 or 80 or 90, remember, we live longer and longer and longer, and there's more people above those ages now than ever before. So study which is the kinds of things that they're going to need. And then as an entrepreneur, try to cater to those needs. I would say those are the 3 biggest opportunities right now.
Mario, thank you so much for taking the time. Best of luck in your new position at Cambridge. I'm sure you're going to miss Philadelphia cheesesteaks and pretzels and all the things that Philadelphia brings. And we hope that you'll write another book and we'll have you back again.
Oh, I would be delighted to be again on your show. Thank you so much. And stay healthy.
Everybody stay healthy, and thanks again. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Take care.